Morena koutou. Nā mihi mai oha kia koutou katoa. I'm going to begin our time together this morning with a slightly abridged poem from Witi I Hamaira. Our watch now. If New Zealand had been Aotearoa, just imagine. The treaty would have been honoured in 1840. Māori would have retained their tīnoranga tiratanga, and Pākeha would have kāwanatanga. Being kaitiaki, we would have heard huia still singing today. Our seas would flourish with the thunder of sounding whales. Matariki would usher in Aotearoa New Year. This is not to say we wouldn't have had wars between us, and through the years that there wouldn't have been pain and lots of anger and tears, but just imagine what might have been. Māori Earth, not Middle Earth. It's our watch now, the time to make dreams come true. Today is a good day to begin. Kia horo te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu tō moana, kia tere te kā rohe mua o tau hoarahi, aia nei a ake tonu atu. May the calm be widespread, no storms, but a glistening greenstone sea instead, and may the shimmer of rainbow-lit spray ever dance over our pathway. Kia ora koutou katoa, he tangata tiriti ahau, ko Ngaire taku ingoa. Just welcome again, everybody, to this one of the Te Tiriti-based Futures seminars on Te Tiriti and governance. And I'm very, very privileged and honoured to be able to chair this session today with Tama Davis and Kate McKegg. Just a little reminder, whānau, about our community code. Kia ora, Rachel. So just for us to remember that this helps us to stay safe and interact safely together. We are encouraging everybody to interact via chat, and I can see that it's already happening in the chat, which is awesome. But if you do have a question for Kate or Tama, please put that in our Q&A. And just big thanks to our two moderators today and our tech support. So I'm really honoured and humbled to be able to be here with Kate and Tama this morning. Tama is of Ngāti Whātua, Waikato and Ngāti Tuwharetoa descent. He has over 25 years experience in public health, mental wellbeing and addiction services. He works within iwi, the NGO sector and district health boards. He's currently the Deputy Chair for Auckland DHB, the Northern DHB's representative for the New Zealand Health Partnerships, and a board member for Comprehensive Care PHO and for Yellow Brick Road, Auckland. He's also an elected member of Ngāti Whātua Ōreke Trust. Now, and my connection to Tama is that we are both soon going to be out of our jobs as deputy chairs on DHBs. I happen to be the deputy chair at Northland DHB. Now, Kate is a Pākeha of Scottish, Irish and English descent. She is the proud mother of 3, grandmother to 1, and wife of Richard Te Mawana Nui. Kate is the director of Knowledge Institute Limited and a member of Connect Group, as well as a Māori-led collective Tuakana Taina based in the Waikato. Kate has over 25 years experience working in government, non-government, philanthropic and community contexts in many Indigenous settings, supporting people to develop their evaluative thinking and practice. And Kate and I are connected through the brief but significant time that I worked with her father, Bob McKegg, at the Northland DHB, and her father, Bob, is well remembered in Tai Tokiro for his contribution to Hauora Māori. So I'm going to hand over now to Tama and then Kate to begin our fireside chat about Te Tiriti and governance and what anti-racism looks like when we start from a Te Ao Māori perspective. Kia ora koutou.
Tēnā koe Ngaire, ngā mihi atu kia koe hei tūwhera tēnei o tātou whiriwhiri kōrero I tēnei ata. So thank you very much, Ngaire, for opening us up with those wonderful words, setting the scene and the beautiful karakia. And you did us justice with your introduction. So ngā mihi atu kia koe. What I'd also like to do is just briefly introduce my tupuna and the area that we settled after our migration here, and acknowledge the environmental indicators that not only shaped us but continue to shape us as who we are as a people here in Tāmaki Makaurau, te tangata whenua. Nā reira, manawa mai te putunga o te āriki, manawa mai te putunga o te taura o te tauira. Kai ke rongorupe, kai ke rangi tāhuahua. Tēnei Ngāti Whātua, tēnei maunga nui ki Tāmaki, tēnei Ngāti, tēnei ngā tapu, tēnei au ka whakatau pōtiki, te tōtā mau o runga Hawaiki, te topa nei te tiu nei kei ngā taumata. Taumata o te reo, taumata o te mātau, taumata o te ora. Whano, whano, haramai te tōki, haumi e, hui e, tāki e. As I mentioned, it's just an extension of the wonderful introduction that you gave to myself. Nā reira, ngā mihi atu kia koe, and I'll hand it over to my co-conspirator in today's conversation. Ngā mihi.
Oh, kia ora koutou. Thank you, Tama, and I just want to acknowledge you, Ngaire, for your beautiful introduction to us. Thank you for that, and for Tama for settling us and giving us those indicators before we set off on this fireside chat. Yeah, so it's my job to kind of start our chat, isn't it, Tama? When Tama and I first met, I want to thank you for reading that poem too, Ngaire. I recall reading Witi Maida's New Net Goes Fishing when I was about 12, and it was one of my first windows into the Māori world and experience as a child. And so thank you for bringing me full circle from childhood to today. But in my first meeting with Tama, I reflected with you, didn't I, about my first and emerging understanding of the injustices, I guess, of colonisation that were experienced by Ngāti Whātua. I shared a childhood memory, and interestingly, it was one with my father, Ngaire. And I used to walk with my father regularly in the morning, and I recall him telling me as we walked past Ōkahu Bay about the clearance of Ōkahu Bay in the 1950s, prior to the Queen's visit. And he was just a schoolboy at the time. He was at boarding school in Auckland. He was born and raised in Palmerston North, but he was at school in Auckland, and he recalled it happening, but he said to me he only later as an adult had come to understand more about the injustice of land confiscation. But that particular incident had stuck with him, and it was because we were passing Ōkahu Bay. I used to have to walk twice as fast because he had big strides and I had little strides. But his journey echoes mine in that as Pākeha, so much of Māori experience of our history is just not told. And we only come to know it accidentally or as adults if we seek it out. And so I also want to remember his influence, I guess, in this journey of mine. He gave me us that mountain to read in the mid-1970s, telling me it had changed his life, and it changed mine too. But I guess for our relationship, Tama, I remember that's where our relationship started, with a conversation about Ōkahu and Ngāti Whātua. So I guess I hand it over to you, Tama, tell us more about the stuff that we don't know about that injustice, the historical legacy of that colonisation, and why it matters.
Yeah, kia ora, Kate. Yeah, it was really powerful actually when we first met. Excuse me, to start at that incident, because that was even though I wasn't there, it is a significant milestone within the contemporary history of Ngāti Whātua, in the sense that it, my grandmother was born in the late 1800s and lived through a period where they were the landlords of all that could be seen within Tāmaki. 360 panoramic view from the top of Maunga Whau, Maunga Kiakia. And in her lifetime, she went from being a landlord to landless and a tenant to the Crown within her own lifetime. And a number of her koe and kaumātua, and today we feel the impacts of the loss that happened due to the inaugural visit of our current monarch here in New Zealand, of Queen Elizabeth. And that is still continues to be a sore point, in the sense that it's never really been recognised as the oppressive action it was placed on a community that was so generous in its invitation to the fledgling nation here at Tāmaki Makaurau. And I remember when I talked about that with you, the impact on it is that we lost almost 2/3 of our senior population, our koe and kaumātua, through the devastation of just complete and utter land loss, and the severing of our connection to our economy. Our spiritual connection to the whenua had been severed. Our ability to leave legacy beyond words was severed, in the physical sense.
Yeah.
But we were very fortunate. When I say we, I mean my generation and the ones before me, that we had our whānau understood the legacies that were left before. And they understood that if you hold on to things, you carry the stories with you, that the fight is never over. And one of the ways we do that today is we remember, actually, through the generosity of the gifting of Tāmaki Makaurau, the original 3,000 acres, which is the CBD in New Zealand's largest metropolitan city today, was an intention of generosity to a new nation in this country, and that was gifted by Apihai Te Kaua, because he understood that there was new knowledge, new technology had found itself on the shores of Nukuroa for us here in Ngāti Whātua, Aotearoa, and our tupuna were savvy operators, and he understood that actually we'd like to have a relationship with you, and we'll start that relationship off by gifting you the original 3,000 acres, as I mentioned, the central business district here in Tāmaki, to settle yourself. Part of that also was to bring law and order to a lawless fledgling city in amongst us.
Yeah.
And when that was done, it was twofold. We didn't want to impose our tikanga, our kaua, our kaupapa on a fledgling nation that we knew didn't understand and needed time to adjust and be a part of that new nation and integration with us. And so we invited Governor Hobson down to Tāmaki, and we celebrate that more regularly nowadays as a community on the 18th of September as being the actual Auckland anniversary day here in Tāmaki for us. That is when he came down into the shores of Taurarua, Okahu Bay, Whakatakataka, and we then was gifted the original 3,000 acres by our tupuna. And from that initial engagement there, As you can see, we started with tragedy with the raising of the village in the 1950s. This conversation, but actually the engagement with the new government. Our fledgling partners at the time was one of pure generosity, openness, and a willingness to work with new technologies, new processes, and we made a commitment to that understanding by that original gift of 3,000 acres, and we continued on through that process from there.
Yeah, it's your story, you know, when we were chatting earlier and when we've chatted before together about the nature of partnering and the relationship that you had hoped, Ngāti Whātua had hoped, and began with this great act of love and generosity, wasn't reciprocated in any shape or form. And as you say, your grandmother's story, your grandmother's lifetime is an illustration of that. And I guess one of my reflections is on, as I have come to understand better the dual histories of Pākeha and Māori in this country, and we don't necessarily know each other's, we have to come, we have completely different perspectives on it, is what I kind of, the behaviours and practices of those of us Pākeha that just normalise the inequity and actually abusive relationships that we have with our Te Tiriti partners, with Māori, and I guess right the way from, and the 1950s incident is an illustration of that abuse. But I guess I still see it today, Tama. I see it in contemporary, in governance context, in commissioning and procurement and contracting processes. I see it where people are, and we talked about this a little bit when we were first together about, you know, where the Crown determines what's needed, or an organisation determines what's needed, and there's just no attempt to develop that understanding of a different perspective, or of what might work or be needed, or anchor the relationship, or even consider it to be a relationship that might be based on some shared principles or kaupapa. There's little trust. There's no trust in the way in which, in the contemporary world, we still operate. We don't recognise the treaty at all as having an impact on that part of our relationships together. And you know, we talk about it as being the history of Crown engagement, but it seems like a contemporary experience, right? Yeah,
and I think you've opened it up there in the sense that we see it repeating the process through procurement and the like. It's there's a lot of engagement in the contemporary world as well, seeking knowledge, acceptance and understanding in Te Ao Māori. But most of that is driven from the Western epistemology, how it's categorized and engaged with according to a function. It values things differently, and as we talked about before, when we talk about relationships from a Te Ao Māori perspective, it's a relationship that builds trust, and then we find partnership and practical ways through those things. And there have been many attempts. Today, Ngāti Whātua are looking for reciprocity and the gifting of the 3,000 still. And that's still something that 3,000 acres, and that's still something that we pursue because we believe in the original gifting of that was in love, and we don't want to let that die. We want to hold on to the fact that that original coming together of us and the intention of that should be the po that drives our contemporary world. So I think one of the things I did mention, and I'd like to share with everybody, is after that utter land loss, of course, we had, those were things that were happening to Ngāti Whātua, yes, but they were happening around the motu. to our whanaunga. Dislocation from land, dislocation from economy, dislocation from our language, our historical mātauranga. And here in Ngāti Whātua, when Bastion Point happened in the 70s as our final stand by our living legend, Uncle Joe Hawke, and many others. But it takes a special kind of person to put yourself on the front line, so to speak, for the benefit not only of your people, but for Aotearoa. That was one of the first times in Aotearoa's history where Māori injustice through breaches of the treaty had a spotlight on them that the nation could see, right? Yeah. And and it divided the nation in terms of the number of our Māori that were in the armed forces, the number of our Māori that were in the police forces, and expected to round up their koe and kaumatua, their whanaunga, standing on their land, making a statement to not only our centre, but to New Zealanders that actually we've got a history here that we're just not acknowledging. We're pushing to the sides. And it is our collective responsibility to understand the mamae that still exists.
Oh, kia ora, Tama. I remember when we were talking about this, when that mamae, and you said it divided a nation, and I told you about the story of it dividing my whānau, that right down the middle, actually. The Bastion Point, the tour, the 70s, right through to 1980. I remember, and my whānau never recovered from that divide. I mean, we still love each other, but the political divide was enormous, and it surfaced so many other isms, if you like, sexism, the racism, the different political divides that we had as a whānau that we had to face. And I remember driving away with my father and my mother from a Christmas with the whānau, and the car was tense. It was very, very tense because there had been arguments and there had been very heated discussions about unruly Māori and what they seemed to be wanting. And my father's had moved, he had shifted in the 70s, and so had my mother. And we had been part of marching and being part of growing up in those marches and activism in our whānau. And so but it was an awakening for us, Tama. And you talked about how for Ngāti Whātua, for yourselves, whilst that was where it was brought to light, for yourselves, you've had to go through a process, a very uncomfortable process of becoming, of partnership and the compromises you've had to make as Ngāti Whātua, right? We get to today.
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. And we continue to do so, right? And a lot of that is constructed processes from the centre. Te Tiriti, our Waitangi tribunal gave us a form of justice or an avenue, right, which can never be fully understood or realised in terms of the injustice and inequity that was opposed upon our community here in Ngāti Whātua. I know our whānau around the motu have got their own experiences of what that looks like, but it is no less tragic and oppressive for my whanaunga around the motu as it has been for us here in Ngāti Whātua, Ōrākei Ngāti Whātua nui tonu. And you see those challenges to I guess even our stakeholders in our contemporary cities, challenging the council around thinking more from a Māori perspective, challenging our health system to understand community intelligence, what sits within our Māori communities, and you know, the millennia of information that sits there and is utilised on a daily basis through its marae tikanga, its whakawhanaungatanga networks, its kumarawai, which is able to stand up really, really quickly. And we saw a huge example of that through the COVID-19 response. Well, the system was trying to figure out how to respond. Māori just did what they do really, really well, and put aroha and love first, and manaaki for our community as the drivers of function.
I'm conscious that in the questions that are coming through, Tama, that they're moving us to the next part of our kōrero, which is opening up the ways in which we might think about reframing and investing in our future, and the nature of the relationships we might have at kind of governance level, or even at whānau and community levels as tiriti partners. And I guess I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that before I reflect on some of my own experience.
Sure, but there are many ways we're doing that, and processes or conferences, online or in person, such as this, is one way of being able to inform ourselves. Māori mātauranga is one way we can acknowledge and expand our collective understanding of what knowledge is, how to value things correctly, and having a real commitment to te tiriti. You know, rather than trying to interpret and translate, let's really look at what it is, honour our commitment from both sides, and construct processes that allow us to do that. Look, I've been fortunate to be in situations where I have been one of the few Māori in the room that has been sitting in a privileged position of authority, and able to actually be a part of a system that allows us to look at high-level positions within healthcare and understand the difference between, well, actually, let's have a Māori and a Pākeha inhabit that space of a director. We believe that collective knowledge can only be good for us going forward, and you get both our Māori ontology coming through, as well as our Western epistemology driving us together. And if you can't have tensions that are positive at those higher levels to shape the system in a way that you want it to reflect the front lines in our community, then you sort of miss the point. You hit the mark, but you miss the point in terms of what it is that you're trying to do around embedding te tiriti in practice.
I guess so, Tama, but I'm also conscious that one of the ways in which for us as Pākehā, we have to shift mind and practice from being, you know, there's almost an assumption and an expectation that we will lead, direct, and we speak too much to supporting and listening, and there is a need as part of becoming a better partner to stand back, to listen more, to allow a Māori space to be a Māori space. And you talked to me earlier about the need for Ngāti Whātua to retrench for a period of time in order to gather itself. And I guess I see the Māori Health Authority, the new authority, as a Māori space, as a space that needs to be there if we are going to honour the treaty in a way that allows our Māori partner to actually lead, and for us to get out of the way for that to happen.
Yeah, kia ora, Kate. Absolutely, it's about understanding our allies and informing our allies, as you just mentioned, that you don't need to take the lead for us. Māori are quite capable of leading a process in a kaupapa that is inclusive. And Ngāti Whātua, as you mentioned, and in particular, after the loss of, after the raising of the marae in the 1950s, the further loss up at Bastion Point in the 70s. We were at a huge deficit in our community life and understanding, while still trying to be the tangata whenua here in Tāmaki, to be that cultural po for a nation that was building up rapidly around us. And we realized quickly through the collective notion of our queer and kaumātua, our network, that we were able to that we needed to just retrench, understand what that deficit that was forced up on us looked like, and come out of that phase prepared to not hand over, but be confident that actually we've now got ourselves to a place where our pātu wata has given us the ability now to stand strong in who we are. And I guess, and sometimes we have to force our partners to the table. And other times we just set the rules of engagement. And we say, actually, it's no longer cool to be able to disenfranchise us from these conversations. And the fact is that we leverage the fact that we can work in the Pākeha, we can work and walk in the Pākeha world at the highest levels. And we're doing nothing but value add to processes. And then sometimes in the co-design, you need to allow us to take the lead in what those processes look like.
Aye. We're being asked questions about principles of governance and practices that as a Te Tiriti partners in a governance context, in the going forward in our contemporary world, what might those be? What might we? What are our thoughts about those things at a governance level? What does that look like if we're practicing that partnership? And you've been on many boards, Tama, and we do have these reforms coming. I know that He Puapua was a lightning rod for some of the Pākehas out there, and also the Three Waters reform is doing the same thing. It's frightening Pākehas because they think that co-governance will be the end of the world. So I guess I'm interested in your thoughts about what are those practices and principles that you would like to see from your Te Tiriti partner.
Yeah, kia ora. It's those are a good start. He Puapua. It's interesting from a Te Ao Māori perspective. It's not a frightening.
No.
It's just an unheard of one. So and it still has its flaws in terms of coming to the table and moving effectively in those spaces. From a Māori perspective, from a governance perspective, I think we honour our tino rangatiratanga. Equity in terms of tangata tiriti. One of the things is we need to really understand what our treaty is. Most New Zealanders don't even understand what te tiriti is, let alone how to incorporate that and translate that into a governance perspective. And so that's the start in what governance for the future looks like from a Tiriti-based perspective is. Actually, let's arm our collective nation up with some knowledge around what te tiriti is. Let's have those uncomfortable conversations around what tension looks like and how we can challenge one another around those things. Because I think Māori are mature enough and in a space that allows us to be generous once again and guiding our Pākehā counterparts through that process. That te tiriti also allows us to have a multinational understanding of what Aotearoa's future looks like. Right? And if we really commit to te tiriti not only through the articles, but through the preamble, and understanding what those aspects are that shaped the willingness of our tupuna to come together and sign Te Tiriti, because that was more in line with Māori philosophy, Māori thinking and understanding of reciprocal relationships and partnering. Once we can really challenge one another in all areas, not just at the front line. Part of the role of governance is to make sure that front line is heard at the governing areas, and we need to arm up our front line to be able to take that process forward for the benefit of all who live here in Aotearoa.
I guess one of the things that, and I want to cycle back right to the very beginning and the gift of those acres to the nation is, it strikes me that in going forward in a governance relationship, generosity has to be at the centre of that, right? And Pākeha are so non-generous. Actually, we tend to be very risk averse. And to try to cling to the power that we have. And I guess that's something we need. It's a mind shift, right? And you're just talking about being generous again, like you're talking about coming to the table with generosity. And we need to practice that. We need to find that generosity within ourselves.
Yeah, agreed. And, from and this is my personal experience within Te Ao Māori, within the Māori world that I grew up in. Power is to serve.
Aye.
And that is the core process that I know that most Māori that I've worked with, they're in positions of authority. It is there to serve and be accountable to the communities that they come from. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to roll over and be nice, but it does mean that, when you're having robust debate and challenge around things, that you can be an adult about how you take the next steps forwards. And as long as your driving influence is to be better, a little bit better tomorrow than you were today, for the benefit of your community and those who put you there, and to serve them well, is I guess one way of being able to work and push forward. Look, there are, like I said before, Kate, there are plenty of our Pākeha colleagues that are on this journey. And it is a real journey of just coming together. And sometimes we need you in our corner, and sometimes we need you to take the lead in particular areas. But more often than not, we just need to know you're there, right? And be willing to be moved around the deck with us. Find a position. And when required, we will, until we find real equilibrium around Te Tiriti here in Aotearoa, it is a process of give and take. And more often than not, in the contemporary Aotearoa, Māori need to be the leading these processes.
Aye. That seems like a point where we could hand back to Ngaire, perhaps, Tama, and she can get us to answer questions that are coming through the Q&A.
Kia ora, kōrero. You were doing such a great job there, though, Kate, of checking out those Q&A. I thought I might be redundant, but what a beautiful kōrero so far, kōrero. Tomo asks us, he says, or they say, love this kōrero, thank you. This kōrero is based on a shared understanding and respect of the importance of our history, tangata whenua, te tiriti or Waitangi. How do you engage with Kiwi folks who don't have this respect? and continue to push against a co-governance or Te Tiriti-based future.
And, I'll have a go at that before I hand it over to my colleague. Yeah, we test the waters, just like standard processes, right? No one, they don't know what they need until they get it, right? And in some cases, we know as Māori, this is going to be a successful process because you'll engage a community that has been disenfranchised from the process. So if that doesn't feed into a greater understanding of our collective notion as Aotearoa, then we I've had conversations with many Māori and non-Māori that don't see the relevance of co-governance today. And that's because they've never seen the beauty of Te Ao Māori. I've had conversations with people who said, well, Māori are just thieves, lazy, on the dole, all of those things. And literally while they're having the conversation with me, saying that Māori don't want to work. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you're talking to a Māori who is a colleague of yours, and you still hold on to that notion. Mm-hmm. And so by addressing bias, and that sits within our communities through co-governance that is successful in what it does, and we know there are plenty of things that are successful outcomes for our community will drive the necessary change. And when Kate mentioned Three Waters and He Puapua as, you know, a lightning rod for Māori, that was that's a good beginning. Let's see how that starts. Let's put some time and energy into that, and surely we will be able to change the mindset of a nation around what Te Tiriti is, and more importantly, what Māori is in this nation of ours through Te Tiriti.
Mm.
Well, yes, I talked about it as a lightning rod because in the Pākeha communities that I am part of, that's what I am witnessing amongst farmers and others, Pākeha farming communities. Those things are threatening to them. They are afraid of what is to come, and it surfaces all their prejudices and biases, those things. And I guess that's one of those. You're right, Tama. It's the examples of co-governance. It's experiencing it so much of, and if we can highlight the good experiences of co-governance. I know some of those exist in, some of those have, they exist. There are examples in schools, in other contexts that perhaps we should be highlighting more in our governance training for people as well. But I guess people have to experience it to know it. It's not enough just to read about it. It's not enough. It's in the end, the conversations that I've had very recently with some of my Pākeha friends and family and those who are part of my world, I enter those conversations with a curiosity about their perspective. I guess that's one of the ways in which I enter those conversations with I'm interested that you should think that. Tell me more about that. And it has helped for them to have to explain a throwaway comment like, I heard only 2 weeks ago about Three Waters, which was that, oh, well, we'll just have to pay for the fish that we take out of the rivers and the oceans before long. And I said, oh, I'm curious about that. Where did you find that information from? And straight away we can enter a conversation, a different kind of conversation, when we can get past the throwaway prejudice and racism that just seems to be the first thing. It's the first reaction that I see in those contexts, and needing to enter with curiosity and questions, and it does seem to settle people and actually make them think twice about the assumptions they're making. So it's an everyday experience for me actually these days, is to be in those contexts, in those Pākehā contexts, because there is change in the wind. The new curriculum is a signal for me of change. The health reforms are a signal. Yeah. Kia ora.
And that's a very practical action as non-Māori, as Pākehā, that we can take, is to question, is to challenge, is to get behind the assumptions of some of the kōrero and the rhetoric. One of our questions that's been voted up lots, and I think you may have touched on it in somewhat, but just if you can elaborate. Hermione McCullum Haere asks, what are some strategies for kaimahi, both tangata whenua and tangata tiriti, who work with Crown entities who champion Te Tiriti-based futures, but are ultimately blocked from any real transformative and long-lasting change by legislation?
Yeah, personally, I think by rallying your colleagues in those spaces, understanding the legislation as well, and challenging it. Just because it's constrained by legislation doesn't mean that you can't challenge what that looks like if it has a detrimental impact, and especially in state sectors, right? And that those are the tools that have been on hand to our Pākehā colleagues forever, that Māori haven't had true access to, because the majority of the voices that were being elevated were at the lower tiers of influence, and part of that challenging those aspects as kaimahi is, as Kate mentioned, supporting your colleagues to have the necessary inquiring questions, probing questions with their colleagues around their biases and their prejudices that come out through that. One of the things, and especially in our state-run organisations, Māori are very few and far between, and sometimes if you're the only Māori in the room, you become the authority in a space that isn't necessarily yours, and organisations don't invest in getting the necessary skill sets, understanding and quality of te tiriti, whakapapa mātauranga Māori, those aspects into an organisation, and they tend to put it on an individual to be the guru for that particular organisation, instead of doing what they do with any other discipline or directorate in their organisation, going, okay, we need a data element, data analysis person. We'll find the best one that's out there and invest in that process. So it's the same thing with Māori. We need to be challenging ourselves, our processes, and saying, actually, this is missing within our understanding, cultural understanding. Let's invest in these spaces.
Yeah, I guess there's a pātai on the chat as well, which speaks into the soul Māori on the board and the weight that they carry. And I know all across the country there are boards, there are groups, governance groups around water, land, reform, all sorts of spaces in which mana whenua are expected to have a contribute in that with that spirit of generosity, Tama, but stonewalled quite often and really find it very difficult to operate because they are a sole contributor in a space where the vast majority of others on that board are ignorant, actually. They're ignorant Pākehā who don't understand Te Tiriti or any other perspective, and that's a tough road. And I guess, my sense is, just as the health reforms are doing and He Pōpua is trying to do. Actually, our legislation needs to change. We need to be moving at that level, at that structural level, to change our legislation around the way in which those governance arrangements are designed, so that those sole operators are no longer having to carry that weight. Would you say so?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, and you know, the fact is, in the health system alone, it's had 180 years to embed its bias to the point where it's invisible, and we're happy with bad stats for Māori.
Yeah.
You know, we continue to say, well, it's about maintenance. We're doing a good job for everybody else. Well, yes, that may be the case, but your partner, who through their generosity shared the whenua with you, is suffering because of the systemic racism that exists within a health system that they support for the benefit of New Zealanders. So I agree, that's a tough road to hoe, and legislation and our systems need to change. But the Māori Health Authority is just one step in that journey. And the thing about it is that Aotearoa Māori aren't going anywhere. So we've got a little bit of time. We just need to accelerate how we get there a lot quicker. It'll be beneficial for us all.
Kia ora, Tama. We've probably got time for one more question, and I might be a little bit selfish and actually ask a question of mine. And in consideration of the health reforms, Tama and Kate, you just mentioned the Māori Health Authority, Tama, and there's lots of optimism about what may be achieved through the Māori Health Authority, but the Māori Health Authority remains, albeit slightly to the side, but it still remains an agent of the Crown, or a part of the Crown structures, or it sits within the Kāwanatanga sphere anyway. Both of you, what would you have liked to have seen, or ideally, if you could envisage the reform of our health system, what would that look like for you? Big question, but you know, think of that for
I'll leave that up to you, Tama.
Any off the top responses? Oh, I was going to say you should go first, Kate.
No, I think Tama should have open slather here.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. So what do you want to see, Tama?
Yeah. Did I freeze?
You're good now, mate. You're good.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. For me, I think I'd like to see the services, the health reform, devolve back into the communities, in particular with our iwi hapu aspects, and understanding what that community intelligence drivers are. I also think it will help us to understand a little bit better the taurahe relationship with our iwi Māori and hapu communities through those processes here. But for me, I think authority being disseminated or devolved back into its communities around locality-based services that are needed locally, as well as the national-based services, the regional aspect, to bring the necessary grunt when required through natural disasters and the like. But in terms of getting some equity in terms of life expectancy, just decent dental care for our tamariki, getting rid of preventable diseases in our communities, that intelligence sits there. And they've got network in those spaces that our systems have, because of the way they've been designed, prevented our community from really engaging in their own health journey and wilder journey. And by doing that, it takes it away from just the clinical aspects of you've got a broken arm, you go here and get that done. Actually, one of the other drivers that bring hauora, waiora to your community, and educating them as well. So that's I guess that's my 10 cents worth around how I would change some of those particular processes in driving the health reforms.
Beautiful. Kia ora, Tama. That's yeah. So we communities in our hapori and within whānau hapua anyway. Yes. So this, I'm here for this. And I'm just reflecting about the kōrero that Yin shared with us during the week as well, and one of his key, one of the many gems that his, the collective and the whānau and everything starts when people connect, and in our whānau and our hapu. Yeah. Beautiful kōrero. Thank you so much. Kate, did you have any last words before we
I don't want to be the one with the last word. I'm
okay.
Very happy with Tama's kōrero.
Yes, it was beautiful. It was beautiful. I'm so aroha mai koutou. We're not going to be able to get to all your questions, but we will send your questions to Tama and Kate, and we will also be able to download the comments and pass those on to Tama and Kate. So I just want to thank everybody again for your participation today. It went very quickly, didn't it, after all? So that was just as it should be when you're spending quality time. We've got lots of people to thank for this event, and I'm part of STIR, which is a core organising group behind this, but there's also, look at all those, that amazing tautoko that this event has got. We have, one of the things that's been occupying my life a lot lately is the last event of the session, our Kei Te Muri o Te Ahi, our Marathon for Racial Justice. So if you haven't already registered, you've got to be there for that. We've got over 40 students and emerging scholars from around the world that are going to be speaking at that. And a final reminder that, join our Facebook page, engage with us on Instagram. We've got this, we're building a movement, whānau, and it starts with us, with you, with the people. So kia ora koutou katoa, and I'm just going to close our hui with in the way that we began, with a karakia. Kia ora. Whakamaua te kōrero, whakamaua te wānanga, whakamaua kia rangi nui e tū iho nei, whakamaua kia papatua nuku e takato ake nei, whakatina ki te tumu o te māramatanga, kia tina, hui tai ki. Kia ora.
Kia ora, kia ora rā. Thank you once again.
Kia ora.
Ngaire, koutou mā, ngā ringa wero. Ngā mihi.
Ngā mihi.